Well, over the last 35 years that I've been in Central Missouri, I've had the privilege of once or twice a month visiting churches in the area and listening to sermons. And then in addition to that, teaching in a couple of different seminaries over a decade and a half, both at the master's level and at the doctor's level, the study of preaching. So I've had a long interest in the subject of homiletics and consider myself a grandson of who many of us assume is the guru of all things in our generation, Haddon Robinson, in the ways that I mentioned earlier of taking the courses that I did. I think it was 8 classes in preaching at Dallas. And then in addition to that, a doctoral program focusing in the area of homiletics, etc. So not all that great at it, but I always tell my students that I've taught through the years that if I can do it, anybody can. And truly, as introverted as I am, I believe that without the study of rhetoric and the principles of homiletics, I couldn't put 2 sentences together and be able to get it out in ways that are occasionally either a bunt or a single. And I think once I hit it, double. But beyond that, it really is an encouragement to all of us because I've been very reliant upon the principles that we're talking about today. And in many ways, academically speaking, this is my life's work. I am a member of the Evangelical Homiletics Society and attend the annual meeting on a regular basis. And so feel very strongly about this contribution to you. So in addition to that, I do some consulting along the ways. And I see several of those that are on our Zoom call who are even in faraway places where I've talked to them about these topics. So as you guys know and gals know that you become experts in just, a few subjects, if at all, or at least have more knowledge than many. And that's true of this for me as well. And at the same time, so therefore I feel like there's a contribution to make. If at any point along the way you feel like I'm talking about you when I say I visit churches and talk about the perils in preaching, just assume that I'm talking about somebody else so that you don't get triggered and distracted. And as these ideas are helpful, I hope that you'll take them and at least share them with someone else. But I really can sum it up in the perils of much preaching, the classes that I've done and the sermons that I evaluate, the consulting, the sermons I listen to. There are kind of 4 things that regularly pop up, and I want to spend some time with that. I could do this and have done it in 40 hours. I've done it in 4 hours, but most of the time I have to do it in about 40 minutes because somebody, John Dreggy, would send one of his campus staff and they would say to me, Dreggy told me that you could help me put a sermon together. And I'd be like, well, when are you going to be speaking? And they're like, Thursday. And I'm like, okay. So, so I had to put it in 4 minutes along the way. And that's the way you get when you know a subject well, you sort of begin. And these are some of those handles. So really there are 4 that I boiled it down to talk to you about today. And the first peril that I think that others may hear is thanks, Pastor, for the history lesson. So too often there's a sense in which we covered so much history. We talked about things that happened in the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman world that it never made the shift or the transition in ways that allow us to know how is this really relevant to our life. So that's a caution and a peril. B is the question when the husband gets home at lunch because the wife was home with a sick kid, and she says to him, so Bill, what was the sermon about today? And well, there's several things that we talked about, and so he'll do his best to kind of mention those. So what are we talking about? What was it about? How does it linger during the course of the rest of the week? And there's no surprise to you that oftentimes it's an illustration or a story is the one that they're able to best repeat. And but I want to talk a little bit about this one of what are we talking about? And as Haddon Robinson said, you know, does it have a skeleton that holds everything together? C is yeah, but. So whatever it is that you and / the biblical author, God and small a, big A, have communicated for that day, then there's a sense in which people are saying, well, that's a really great idea, but you just didn't know my dad, or you're not aware of my company that I have to work for. And so there's something in there about, yeah, but, and the kinds of excuses that can come up along the way as to why we can't do what it is that the divine ethic invites as a result. And then the last one is, got it. Where do I go from here? Like, you've sold me. I'm with you. I could see how my life would be more flourishing as a result, but I don't think I'm going to be able to change my mind or create a new habit in the course of this conversation, even if you had an invitation at the front, at the end. I still, where do I go from here with this information? So something like what a bibliography does in a resource and footnotes, what do we do with those? So these are the 4 perils that I would suggest to you. And I have been helped by Haddon Robinson's book, as have some or many of you, in a classic called Biblical Preaching, the development and delivery of expository messages. It's safe to say that this is the standard. Haddon Robinson didn't really come up with a lot of new stuff. He just rephrased it and reworded it because he stood on the shoulders of works like Grady Davis, and before him, who stood on the works of Phillips Brooks, who before him stood on the shoulders of Aristotle in a book called On Rhetoric. And so these are rhetorical tools, and they got translated applicationally, but in, I'll call it my day, and this is still true, that this is the sort of the place that preaching classes in most evangelical Bible colleges and seminaries have gone to, or some reiteration of it. So whether you're communicating for a change, you know, the genesis of that all resides here. Don Sanuki, in a book called Invitation to Biblical Preaching, he took this and made it a more technical resource as a result. In this resource, then are 3 developmental questions that's found in chapter 4, and it's in what he calls stage 4 of the development and delivery of a sermon. And in that, he suggests 3 development questions that are critical as you're working through the process. And 3 of those hit at the 4 that are mentioned above. So if you'll take note on your notes where it says, and I realize that our crew at home don't have access to this, so you're listening in. Regrets for that. So make the move from Atlanta next time, Jason, and then yeah, I'll look for a way. If you email me, I'll send these to you. How about that? But basically, you can hear the outline. But if you'll notice in the outline, B is the start under the developmental questions. You see that? That's on purpose. So A, I'm holding till last. So B, C, and D are the 3 developmental questions that are mentioned here. And then A will follow, because it's one that I've added to the book that I think is critical. So B, and in here, Haddon Robinson, in these pages, says these are the operating system that float underneath the waterline in the development of the sermon, and as you move into the delivery, get these questions answered. And that is, what are we talking about, Pastor? What are we saying about what we're talking about, Pastor? What is it that, if we add speech act into that, what are we doing with this? What difference? How does this have meaning in my life? So what is it that we're talking about? And again, many of you would know that rhetoric is best served by a clarity, the kindness of clarity. And in that clarity, you have a subject and a complement. You have what starts with a how, a when, or a what. A how, a when, or a what. And in those, because where and when, are not they don't go anywhere. That's the history lesson. But the how, the what, and the why get at the ways in which this shows up in real life. So what are we talking about is the subject that we're discussing, the topic. And then on the other hand, there is the assertion, and that's the complement. And so therefore, what are we talking about? We're talking about the fact that there is a commodity called elders. There's a commodity of mothers and fathers who have been in the faith for a long time. What are we talking about today? We're talking about how to take advantage of an underutilized resource in our faith community. Now, what are you saying about what you're talking about? The commodity of aging is a resource that youngers should take advantage of. We might restate that 2 or 3 times, but what are we talking about? Hey, honey, what was the sermon about today? It was about the fact that there's an underutilized resource that exists in our faith communities that I'm not sure that I'm taking advantage of. Oh, well, what did the preacher say about that? Well, the preacher communicated that we should ask them, tell me a story, and then say to them, tell me more. So that's what we were talking about. We were talking about how to utilize elders in our own development of our lives. Do I have a mentor or mentors who are older and wiser as a result? So the clarity of starting with an unfinished question that begins with the word how, when, how, what, and why, those allow me to then be able to focus the subject in order to then get clarity about what the complement is. Now, we know that this is what I like to call a theological thrust. In other words, because it's a sermon as opposed to a talk, it therefore is rooted in an intention of the small a, big A biblical author. So the text itself is presenting something, but the peril is that if we hit 2 or 3 of these. All right, I'm going to keep this short so I can wrap up as quickly as I can, so then we can have conversations. And whatever question you ask, I can teach what I want to talk about around it. So that's what we'll do. File that away. That's helpful. I got about 3 answers, and no matter what question, I just hope I can, or you can guess the answer that I want to give. So, and ask that question. So to keep this brief, what I'm saying is that sometimes you have to reorder the text. You have to take the language that was written in the ancient Near Eastern and you put a Western spin on it, and the biblical authors won't be offended by your translating what they were translating from God to their audience. In fact, they'll celebrate it. So therefore, there's a reordering of the text, or if you will, even a summarizing of several theological thrusts. So a part of even just a couple of weeks ago when I was consulting a pastor, a youth pastor who has some interest about future preaching, and I was working with him on a sermon that he gave, I was able to say to him, why did you go to that one last scripture as justification? Like, land the plane when you were done, but what was it that was compelling you to one more time? So therefore, if you need more time, let me speak plainly. A peril of expository preaching is that you've committed yourself to chapter 1 this week and chapter 2 next week and chapter 3 the next week. And even if you use the subheadings, you're still bound by something like, and all of a sudden you have a straitjacket and you're not able to, in the midst of the development of the sermon, you're feeling compelled to cover all of chapter 1. Now, if the problem is biblical literacy or illiteracy, then does that mean that we're going to have to give more text if we can't make as many assumptions? Do we have to say more because God knows they need it? Or does it actually mean that we're going to have to feed differently as a result? And I think that wisdom would suggest to us that as a result of that, we're going to have to slow the boat down. We're going to have to work with the theological thrusts that we think are expedient and are the ones in which the congregation needs. Now, let me pause to say I'm not unaware that we are caring about teaching people the Bible. But what we are also talking about that is often missed is that we're talking about an expository preaching. And expository preaching means that the intention is the same as the text that we're dealing with says. The theological thrust is the same. Now, I didn't make up the rules, and therefore I didn't say that you put your name on the sign with the title or on the website that says everyone welcome. But if everyone is welcome, then all of a sudden there's a difference between coming into an institute or a lunch lecture or having a commentary session and the ways in which people are just coming in off the street. So again, I know, but our commitment to hospitality is saying to them, hey, I'm including those who are farthest away and who don't have as much knowledge as they used to have. And so therefore, it adjusts the ways in which I may have to do less of the text or one theological thrust in order to get clear about what does this mean and not make so many assumptions about how people get it. All right. I know you have thoughts and questions and want to push around. We'll come to that. C on our page. Is it true? So the second developmental question is, do they buy it? Not only what does it mean, but do they buy it? So when we say things in a hurry, like, you know, he rose from the dead. A serpent talked. We act as if people have snakes that are talking to them in the garden. And at least acknowledge that that's a problem. At least we're able to say, hey, you know, this may be outside of our understanding, or we don't go to worship idols in this kind of way. And again, these are things that you do. So I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to people that you're helping to talk to who may be violating this. So therefore, is it true? It means that we stop to deal with the hurdles. If we say, be kind to your parents, you'll live longer. That's pretty clear. But I don't know what it means unless I say, well, there's 3 emphases of the word honor in the scriptures. And one is to honor in your younger years means to obey your parents. In your middle years, it's to look to them as you would an older brother or sister or a senior who know you well for advice, but you treat them more as a peer. And then there's a transition to caring for them financially to ensure that they are not without housing and medical care and clothing in their older age. Until we nuance in those kinds of ways, people don't know what it means, and they don't know if it's true, especially if they're saying back to you, well, you didn't know my dad and what a jerk that he was. I don't have to do that. And so without the kind of dealing with the hurdles and the barriers, that can be a real peril in preaching. And this question of sitting with, do people buy it? Do they think it's true? Okay. Or someone might hear my sermon, aging or saging, this idea taken from the intentions of what Jacob said to Joseph and to his sons Manasseh about there's a commodity that exists in our faith communities of elders, and a way to access that commodity is by asking them the question, hey, tell me a story, like Jacob told to Joseph and his sons. Tell me a story. Hey, tell me more. And so we see that unfolding there in the book of Genesis. Well, people that then say, well, we don't have any qualified wise seniors in our church, so therefore I can't do it. So just if that's a barrier, then I'll be saying to them in the midst of that message, hey, now, you might say, look around, like, Tanya and Elias, are the oldest people in our community. And they're 43. So, but get to know some other seniors in other faith communities, and look for people through whom you can connect through other organizations or ministries that exist within our community. Honesty, Pastor, will cost me my income unless we navigate, at least acknowledge that this is going to be hard, that, that a talking snake, what are some of the options? God creating the world and how that fits in with a astrophysicist or evolutionary thinking, at least acknowledging those are a part of the persuasion that can be, if not done, a peril to our preaching. D, so what? I like to call this the sort of preaching the announcements or inviting people into a discipleship process. So the ways that I don't call this application, because when you do what is listed in A, which we're coming to, when you've done that, then the whole sermon is applicational. It's all relevant. So instead, I think of this so what, as what are the next steps? I got it. You sold me. I think I'll try it. And then to be able to preach the announcements to say, and if you're struggling in this kind of way as a step parent, then we have an upcoming workshop happening in July. If you're struggling with this and this becomes an issue, then you really need to become a part of our 12-step programs that happen here or in another faith community. If this is an issue for you, then I'm going to be planning a series that I'll be addressing that coming up in September. So just make a mental note. Hey, there's a great resource, a bibliography. Again, these are things that you all do. But, there's a great resource and it's in our library. We've made some extras available. I've asked our on and on and on, that you're moving into your discipleship processes to say, hey, that's why our small groups exist. So regularly we're able, beyond the applications that we're making to our personal life, we're also saying, and we are a resource center in order for you to be able to be helped by them. And then finally, A, who cares? Who cares? So therefore, there is well, let me just let Haddon Robinson address this. In something I would strongly commend to you, I did not put it on your paper, but you can easily find it. And this is on YouTube. It's called Preaching into the Wind. Preaching into the Wind. There's a part 1 and a part 2, and this was the National Preaching Conference that was only held one time out at Biola. And there's a sermon in part 1 where Haddon Robinson preaches. So if you haven't listened to that, but then he did a Q&A that's called part 2. And he was addressing, as you will hear, some of the sort of learnings that he's had. And this was towards one of his last actually meetings before he died. So let me share this with us, and we'll watch together.
It's hard to talk about all the different changes, but one thing I think has changed. and it's influenced by television. I think that you don't have enough time now to fool around before you preach. I think introductions have taken on a greater significance than they had in the past. I think that comes because when you turn on a television program, a program made for television, they know that they have literally 20 seconds to get you to listen. We have clickers in our hands, and if you haven't turned the program on deliberately, you click it, it takes off. You got 150 channels, you never come back. So it used to be you could, last week we're in Genesis 32, and next week we'll be in Genesis 33. If you know your math, we should be at Genesis 34, I just don't have the time to do that anymore. The television and how we watch it has changed all kinds of things. They know they've got to get you in 20 seconds. And people come to church with clickers in their heads. And they like it or not, and that's one change. I mean, the whole structure of the sermon changes. I think a second thing that I see happening is the method of delivery. I think we talk with an audience more than we talk to them, and certainly more than we talk at them. There's that conversational sort of tone that is very much influenced, again, by the media. I think to stand up and holler at an audience, you may feel like doing that as a preacher, but you ought not do it. And if you watch television, my daughter was on the NBC station in Corpus Christi for a while. They do everything to make it look like she's just talking to the audience. I mean, they have a machine that has a script, but that script goes on with eye contact always directed at the audience. You can't afford to be something different in church. People expect that you're going to talk with them. So I think those are things that the whole mode of preaching has changed because of the media.
Good, thank you. If there's a genre of the Bible that you would recommend we really master for today,
well,
what would it be?
If I'm right about what I just said about the media, one of the nice things is that when the Bible communicates, it communicates its story.
Okay, so I'll just leave you with that as a teaser, because he then goes on to talk about, again, what we know, that 68% of the scriptures is written in narrative, and so talks about the power of story as a result. Okay, stop share. Say again. Oh, across the top.
Red button.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So as a result of that, I wrote an article for Preaching Magazine called Stop Starting with the Text. We don't care. And in the introduction of that article, I say, I know we don't care because I'm a theologian. I'm paid to care. And at 10:30 on a Sunday, after all that it takes to get there, I don't care. And so therefore, help me care about what Luke 11 says. Talk to me about why this is important. Create the relevance and the application of what difference is this going to make in my life. And this actually highlights the text. It does what I think the biblical authors and God would want us to do, in terms of saying, in the same way that they took God's divine ethic and God's expectations, invitations for them, and they translated them in a kind of understandable and relevant way. We're actually having a higher view of Scripture if we are saying why this matters. And then when we take them to the text, we help them to say, yes, Pastor, I see it too. Now, as a result of that, I've evaluated many sermons across the board yeah, I've done many. There's always a sort of a secret sauce that happens in preaching where people learned it in a Bible college or seminary. And that is they end with 3 application points. And when I talk about if you buy into this peril in preaching and you answer it by the question, who cares? All I'll do is I'll go grab, see if you can hang with me on this. I'll grab the subject, the tensions, the subject of their application points. There are 3 applications at the end. I'll grab the subject and I'll drag it to the first move. And then I'll create a real life situation around it. So their application is something like, therefore, if we think that this is true, then we should invite elderly, wise, we don't know if they're wise yet, but we need to invite sages, aging sages, into our homes for dinner. Well, drag that, hey, do you find yourself wanting a mentor, someone who had gone through this before? I'll drag that into the first move and then rain that down and let that application unfold throughout the entire sermon. And then that would point 2 and point 3, our application point 2 and 3. And I remember just so many times these pastors, they would say, oh, that's brilliant. How did you do that? And I'm like, you did it. It's just called journalistic tension. You create the journalistic tension to why does this matter in my life? And then rain that down as a result. Now, I have used these 4 developmental questions in multiple ways beyond preaching. It's how I have created staff conversations that I need to have. Like just asking myself the question, move 1, what's at risk if this family doesn't hear from me today? Move 2, what am I saying to them? What do I want them to hear? What's the most important thing I want them to walk away with? A big idea. Move 3, why won't they buy it? What are the barriers that make them say, yeah, but, so try to address the barriers. And then move 4 is, and here's what I want you to do as a result. So this is really helpful in leading staff. I never look at a blank piece of paper if I'm wanting to write an article. I always am answering a question. I'll take letters and correspondence. I could go on and on and on. I'm never stuck because I know that these are what you do, the core rhetorical tools. I tell pastors who are just beginning, hey, we don't want a formula. We want you to find your authentic voice. But until you do, don't think you're interesting if you're not. And wait for other people to tell you that you are. And so I'll just say to them, work through these 4. And they say, well, yeah, but, and then they get stuck on time. And I'm like, no, I'm not talking about not dealing with the text thoroughly. Of course, that's what sermon, but how much text? And what other time do you need? So whatever rules that you're limited by, 25 minutes, 35 or 55, you still have to work within these parameters as a result. On the additional page that I gave you, I'll hold this for now and see if it comes up in our conversation. But literally in my front of my Bible, when I'm invited to prepare a talk, a sermon, a message, etc., then these are things that are actually there. So I'm recommending that you cut these out, at least the bottom 2, and the whole page, just stick it by your computer, because at the bottom is magic. It's called an application matrix. I heard it first taught by Haddon in Kansas City 35 years ago. And then Don Sanukian developed this for us. And that is just think through saying it differently. Our illustrations and our stories, our applications tend to often go to whatever experiences that we have in whatever season we are. But this will force you to begin thinking about the single mom who has a roommate in order to afford the rent. This will help you to do what I did earlier when I used the words Elias. instead of the word John, because I crossed cultures. I'm speaking now to a cross-cultural reality. I'm mindful, if you will, of even the empty seat that I wish was filled. So this will help you to move through that. Before it is simply, how do we find the big idea? And these are just kind of a summary of hermeneutical statements along the way. And so, what change in society would this passage achieve, this theological thrust, if it were followed? And I just find that that's a really helpful tool as I'm trying to make the move from my exegetical work, from my expositional or timeless work, and then I begin to move into a specific context in which I am speaking into, making a homiletical and then a missional or apologetic move. All right, and so with that, I'll read you a quote that is also in my Bible that my wife gave me some months ago. And this is the first time I've used it, so tell me what you think. A liturgy before taking the stage. What have I to offer here that might sustain the souls of others? Alone, I have little more to show beneath this scrutiny of lights than my own pride and insecurity, my craving for praise, and my fear of rejection. Rather, dear God, let me offer something greater in this place, O Christ. As I step onto this stage, meet me amidst the wreckage of my ego and my own woundedness, and through me, give what I alone cannot. And everybody said, Amen. All right, Craig, some reflections from you to get us started, and then we'll open it up for further conversations. How's this, have you applied any of these or your experiences with them?
Well, I think it almost got me fired. Like, I think I truly, like, following these truly almost got me fired.
Okay,
I think they don't leave you anywhere to hide. I think when you tell people, like, the whole, like, what is at risk if they fail to hear from me? Haddon Robinson, I think, coined this phrase that sounds really nerdy, but I see it everywhere. It's like the ladder of abstraction. So if you're high, you're very abstract. So if you're like, love your neighbor, so it's abstract. But then when you get to like, when your wife says, like, respond this way, that's concrete. This, I think, works because it climbs down the ladder as much as appropriate. And you have to be clear. So I used to err on like the history lesson, like, man, in Genesis 1, it's all about the ancient Near East temple construction, and you're like, cool. And people like that because they feel they learned something about Genesis 1, but that really quickly creates an echo chamber. But if you can bring it to why do they need to know that? What is at risk if they fail to hear from you? If you put that first, some people don't like that. But it's wonderful. I think I don't want to go back, but it does. There's risk.
it's people, when you're clear, people get it.
People get it.
Yeah. All right. Reflections, questions here or Zoom? Pushback? What propped up? Takeaways?
Tell me if this is too far off the trail. But more of a general question. How shouldn't posting sermons online? How is it through this grid? How has it changed things, right? Or how shouldn't it, and how should it affect the way that I'm thinking about that, right? Because the one main thing I think about is you're talking about audience. Well, now your audience is the world, I don't know. Is that too general of a
Well,
question?
no, my opinion is that, well, remember, I only have 5 answers. And so
You make a good politician, right? You just bring it back to your talking points.
I navigate that with having Zoom. And a thing that I'm mindful of is that I prioritize the people in the room. So while the people in the room are prioritized, I'm also can be mindful in the priority list of those who are observing. And even one of my homiletical hacks is preach to the empty chair, or the person that you wish were in the room. Because by doing so, you're teaching people how to talk to that person. And secondly, you're also teaching them that they can feel safe to invite the empty chaired person into the room. So I think it's legitimate to preach to the empty chair, but again, within a priority list. And so as a result of that, they're not the same benefits of experiencing, and that's a choice or a preference or a decision that I'm making along the way. The other thing I would say about it is that Bill Hull's The Disciple-Making Church, of which Rick Warren picked up on in the Purpose-Driven Church, has this idea of core, congregation, crowd, and then city. And essentially, his big idea in that book is that evangelism is the farthest expression of making disciples. It's the outer circle. And that message, an appropriate message for the appropriate audience, is come and see. And so ways in which we can make ourselves accessible to come and see, and yet at the same time, we make it inconvenient enough, or we continue to remind them that there's what do we call it? Invitation? Yeah, let's stop there. A divine wish of God, a perfect will, ultimate will of God. And that is that we all move into the center circle, that we keep making moves. And so as a result of that, I think I can have a mindfulness about the ways in which this gets used without it impacting this getting done. So again, I practice this by not recording some things so that I can have a kind of conversation, or making this unlisted so that you have to have access to it, or not recording it at all, or deleting it once it's done, or editing what's not helpful in that part of it.
And I assume then you're writing a sermon for the congregation of those, that's the city you're writing it for, but you're aware that the city in
Can
essence
hear.
is listening in on
That's
it.
right.
And that is a shift.
And I do my part to ensure that the appropriate message gets to the appropriate audience, and to not do so is not good stewardship or a dereliction of duties, is the way I would process that along the way. And if I can't do it, again, my priority list forces me back into making a different kind of decision. But that's applicable along the way. Who do we let use our facilities? All those kinds of things have those outer circle issues. Because we are a discipleship formation. That's the business we're in. What business are we in? Thank you. Others?
I've got a question. I'm not sure if I can word this right. So within the structure, I know if you're teaching or preaching at times, you're covering the same material, but if you're doing 8:30 and then you're doing 10:30, that balance between not reiterating the same thing, but the Spirit will move you, just bring up different examples or something like that. How does that balance out? I know once I did a Bible study and I did a teaching, and a couple that was there, they said, "Oh, we're sorry that so-and-so wasn't here. This would have been good for them. Can you do this again?" I did it again. They said, "You didn't cover the same material." And I said, "Yes, I did. It's all the same scriptures, but the emphasis for that moment, you know what I'm saying? It wasn't just writ, it was
Yeah, thank you.
moving in a different direction. You know what I'm
Thank
saying?
you
So-
for that. I really appreciate it, because it gives me the opportunity to give one of my 5 answers that I forgot. Is that when I look at a page like this, I try to make it a practice to be mindful of the white space. Now, I do not want to minimize the white space. So therefore, I don't want the white space to turn into a flippant answer either. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to belabor it. But the white space is always, what is God asking of me? What's needed in the room? Where's Jesus? And that is the sensitivity of the Holy Spirit. And I find that mindful of the white space as more than just a throw off. It deeply forms me. And there's lettering, there's an outline, there's a clarity. And so therefore, we're always willing to adjust. Yeah, so a thing I'd want to say is I remember at a preaching conference that John Ortberg was the host of. I'll never forget, and this is back in, for those of you who know what I'm talking about, this was back when Rob Bell was still in the evangelical stream. So Rob Bell had taught in the morning session, and John Ortberg got up in the afternoon session, and he said, I know you all heard Rob Bell say to you, just take the basically the stages of sermon development, just throw them out the window and just sort of be like an artist and create. But he said, Ortberg said, but that's wrong. Don't do that. That's terrible advice. And what's even funnier about that is that when you actually have studied Rob Bell's, 6 hours that he taught one time on how to preach, he knows the rhetorical tools. So I always say to my students, know the rules in order to break the rules. Find your authentic voice. But until you do, follow the rules. And so that's sort of the balance that I would have. Of course, we're always sensitive. And that's exactly what you are communicating. So I just affirmed the very thing that you experienced, I think. So, thank you. Yeah, here's some seasoned sagers. Pastor Bert, your reflections or thoughts, or Clay? These perils in preaching?
I should have listened to you 40 years ago.
Yeah, that, I'm
Okay.
thinking the same thing. I've broken them all. Failed at every one sometimes.
That's good. Which, is there one or two of them that resonate with you all that you would say, yeah, I want to grow in, or one that I'd say it's been, that I feel challenged by, or anything like that? Or otherwise, I nailed. Jamie, you as well, please.
I appreciate your question on the underutilized resource. I thought, would you talk a little bit more about that? Just how that can be a
Underutilized, remind me.
resource. You were talking about that, the underutilized resource when you're asking questions. How do we engage people in an interest in this subject? What is available to them if they listen to you, if they consider what you've got to say in that meeting, if they consider the passage or the truth that you're
Okay.
talking about. Yeah.
Well, to me, this becomes the impetus and it becomes what the staff then and key volunteers meet together, the elders and deacons, and they say, Pastor, you raised a very important concept. People who marry into a blended family, they don't know how to parent their stepchildren. How does this instruct the resource that we're going to create in our church calendar? That's what I mean by it. And if the answer then is, well, our church calendar can't sustain it because we have 6 weddings this year in the building. And also, how the Scouts uses it on Thursday night, and so it's not available. And then we've also got that quilting club that meets. Then everybody needs to pause and ask themselves, what business are we in? The facilities business? And we need to do, again, like the thing, we need to start drawing back on our extensions, our circles, in order to say, we got to reallocate resources so that we get Ron Deal here, who is I would start with, and his teaching for the last now 30 years on step families. And we need to make something available to say to them, you're not their parent. And so as a step parent, you need to be very cautious about how you discipline your stepchildren, especially in age appropriate ways. They need some practical help in that. So the pastor doesn't have to do all that, but I think that it sort of says, hey, we don't have anything that's a really great resource. I don't know of anything. If someone knows, please share it with us and we'll send it out to you in an email or on our weekly podcast this week. But it's also about saying, well, we can't do that right now, but Young Life does that and they have a regular meeting. And so therefore, let's join up with them in the ways that many of us would do with something like Love Columbia. So we think about the discipleship of each of the age groups and the various groups. So we don't have a Spanish church, therefore, we need to get Omar in here and so that he could talk to us about how we could partner, because this is needed for your neighbors, because we don't speak Spanish or we don't have a Spanish class. But Chris Cook has a deaf translator every Sunday. Does that help?
Thank you.
So those next steps are both personal, but they're also corporate. And I think of them, a way I think of them is how to preach the announcements. Because if people buy it, then they're going to say, well, what else is there? And a bibliography and footnotes in a book do that for us. It says, if you want more information, this is a source that you can go to. And so in our preaching, we're mindful of the things that we're inviting them to do. The speech acts, the ways in which the world gets different as a result of the conversation we've had.
That's good. Thanks.
Question? Do you have time?
Please.
Okay, so I think I'd have some curiosity about either maybe your experience or how you've navigated in light of B. What does this mean? Like to translate and interpret the text without offending biblical writers, but then also communicating clearly to those in the room, maybe the XPC. So doing that work, I think I have some curiosity also about if I can like pull in, I don't remember like the words they used for this is like a while ago, like the river concept. I remember being drawn on the board, like where there's different churches at different places.
That's
the
right.
river.
We're a branch in the river towards Christ likeness. So let's function as a river church rather than a lake church. In other words, well, Pastor, we don't have this, we don't have that. Well, what we do have is we're this part of the branch of the river. We can always grow the river widely without compromising our core part.
Yeah.
And so this is who I am. Yeah, I say to pastors, as you've heard me say, and ministry leaders, do not create ministry that you don't want to be a part of. When you're bored by your services, stop. Okay, so we at least got to be in a room so that we do what we're enthusiastic about doing.
Yeah.
That's why I'm bringing David Clark, and anybody's welcome to join me. You don't have to apologize if you can't come, because I want to hear from him again about these. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I love
Back
that.
to you.
Even like having that, like to remember that word, like don't open up ministry that you don't actually want to do.
That's
Like
right.
that's helpful to
A little bit of enthusiasm makes up for a whole lot of perils.
That's true, right?
Yeah.
So I guess a question that I'm wondering is what has discernment looked like for you? What can it look like when we're holding those tensions between maybe even accepting where we are in the river? Like wishing for something more expansive, especially when we're looking at the text or like thinking about what could be said. I guess I'm wondering where is like the holding what is real and true between who potentially might be in the room, but that's not actually that's not where we're at in the river. I don't know. I guess I don't even know how to conclusively ask that.
Yeah, I think I feel like you're saying something about there's certain giftings and there's certain interests, there's certain vibes of the communicator, and then there's the experiences within the audience itself and the listeners, and how do we hold those together?
Yeah, and I think also if I can add even to make it even more complex, is thinking like, okay, we do have a spectrum of like pre-understanding in the room also. And so like to preach one direction toward people that are coming on with like a more dense pre-understanding, but maybe not privilege as much those with the lower pre-understanding, or vice versa, to go the other extreme. In a sense, we're kind of establishing ourselves on the river.
Yeah.
And so I guess those are the kind of questions I'm wondering about.
Yeah, what comes to mind is the analogy of a meal.
Yeah.
And the meal is that depending on the environment that you're in or that you've created, or whether or not you put a sign up in the front, etc., or what time the service is, who gets invited. Then the meal is that if I asked all of you to come to my house next Friday night and I said we're gonna eat together, I think there are certain assumptions and expectations as a result. But if I texted you just before you came and I said, hey, Janet, can you stop by and pick up a bag of onions? And by the way, only Gerb's, Jamie, has the kind of meat that I eat. And so therefore, if you'll grab some pork chops from Gerb's. And by the way, when you get here, if you do have a sharp knife, bring it with you. All of a sudden, there's an invitation into a kind of, I'm inviting you to come in the kitchen and we're going to fix the meal together. And I'll teach you how to cook. I don't think that's your expectation. I think you're thinking that when you get there, the meal's going to be within 30 minutes going to be provided. And so therefore, there's a kind of hospitality that I'm primarily talking about. My template is a weekend experience. Now around that, there are branches of the river, and this is what I think you're getting to, who are saying, I'm mindful of the fact that you want to eat, but I also want to teach you how to cook, because there's an assumption around here about all of us are becoming cook development along the way. I'm actually now saying, back to what we were just talking about, that in being mindful of all that, depending on where we stand, the question is not, does your weekend experience, is it hospitable to those who are farthest away? That's not the question that I think has to be asked. The question is, what is your outreach? What is your discipleship for those who are farthest away? And every church has to answer that. And it's kind of like I invited, over a decade, I invited the guy who did it was a company where he did some handyman work for us. And so a few weeks ago, I got a text from him. He said, can I just come to, what church do you go to? And then it was, do I need to register?
Oh.
And then after he came, he did come 2 weeks ago. Then after he came, he texted me and he said, was that wine? Because I've been sober for 3 decades. And so therefore, it reminded me again of the ways in which, what are we doing? Because it got real personal, right? At that point, like, who's going to say it's grape juice? Again, I informed me, he said, well, if I come back, I'll know or something that I can participate. So that's the way I'd say it. But it also begs, and this is my last thing to say, is that I still wish for, and I'll go straight up and say, I think we've catered to the culture in these ways. And the way we cater to the culture is to say, I only have them for a weekend. And then we say, I only have them once or twice a month. And I think that is an inappropriate application of hospitality. So what I mean by that is that we can say 2 things to them. One is, this was an appropriate meal prepared for you. And I know Pastor Burt has done this, and maybe it still is. But if you'll come back at 5 o'clock tonight, I'll take you even further into the kitchen with me. So I left a lot on the editing floor. So let's do that. And if you think that was something, then you come back on Tuesday afternoon and I'll teach you the original languages. So be there at 4 o'clock. So what we're doing is we're not catering, we're just saying it's an appropriate invitation. So if you want to learn how to cut the onions and do what I do, back in my day, we called it teacher training and training union, right? You know that, as a result. And therefore, by saying to people, I know I'm only going to have them once a month or twice a month. It's like, again, I'm for a kind of review, but it mainly just says, we have it recorded. If you missed it, go get it, because we're also taking this train down the field, down the road, down the tracks. And so, jump in. Yeah, that's enough from me. Anybody else want to respond? Or
Well, I wonder too, like, I hear you saying about like assumptions that set our place in the river. And there's like 2 kinds of assumptions I think preachers make. One is like the knowledge assumption. So that's like the statement, well, like it says in James, and then they'll start the verse and then they expect people to finish it, that kind of thing, like. Consider it pure, that's like a huge assumption that I think sets your place in the river, but then the other one too is like a character assumption. Assuming that the people here may want to obey this. Assuming that the people here are crushing it, and so this is just a review, like we're kind of just. And then those assumptions, I think, set your place in the river and then stall you out, depending on where you think you are and how you're gonna do. And then, yeah, or you just get everybody together and yell at them.
That's very effective.
Super, yeah.
Oh, that works?
Yeah,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, that's part 2 of this lecture series,
And
How
just,
to yell,
how to yell.
how to yell effectively.
just so that everybody's aware, this is really what Jana is talking about. This idea of a lake church versus a river church is really handy in the sense that, we can sit around finding ourselves as staff members and we're asking the question, how many people swim in our lake and how many people are around the side? And therefore, all the conversation becomes is we were effective because we lost 10% or we gained 10% or whatever. And this is those 3 beads of budget and butts and buildings and et cetera, et cetera. And it's just not very motivating. It's not unimportant to ask these kinds of questions. It is a part, but the better one is to understand the fact that as a river church, we're moving people upstream into Christ likeness. And we ask the question, what is our part here in the community? What model? What do I care about? Who do I want to be? All the factors, who do we have? What's in our hand? And we get very intentional then, and we can always widen the river, but we can't deny our part of the river, that this is how God has wired us. This is the gifts. And when people then say to us, well, I'm going to go swim in another lake, there's a variety of motivations, of course, and it's still depending on when, anyway. See, I have a filter and I'm still using it at 63 and a half.
I have another question.
And so as a result of that, that's what that means. Yes, sir.
So he said in the video, the part A that you added was maybe more important than it used to be. Are any of these less important? Like, what are we giving to
No,
get
they're-
that? Not that you're
They're
confined by
timeless.
30.
They're all timeless. That's my answer.
Okay.
They're timeless and they all matter. And if you don't, for instance, if you have a sermon that says Deuteronomy 25, 12 and 12, and that is, if a woman grabs the private parts of a man, cut off her hand. You don't have to spend much time on move 1. You've got my attention. I just heard you make something really relevant. And so as a result of that, and I had preached that passage before. And got a Canadian $20 bill. So I'll tell you that story offline, but I keep it in my wallet. Because how does the law apply to our lives? And it was a sermon on law enforcement. It's very powerful because that's an incredible passage. So you don't need much with that. So the biblical text does, but in that sense, it's relevant. All of a sudden, it's relevant. But even though people that I very much love and have respected, and I mean primarily Dr. Heath, who I taught with at the seminary for a long time, students would go into his class, and Caleb, I think, is with me today at Reading Christian Fellowship out in California. So he experienced this, but you go in Dr. Heath's class and he'd say, and he and I had a great relationship. He's been here. He went to a game with me. He texted me when we were in the Cotton Bowl and sent me a picture. He had his Mizzou sweatshirt on, but he would say, Rod teaches that you need to make your preaching relevant. You don't need to make your preaching relevant. The Bible is already relevant. And so I'd have conversation with him and I'd say, well, why don't you use Chrysostom's liturgy in your church? Why do you translate it? Well, we got to make it understandable. I'm like, okay, right. And that's what the biblical authors did. And that's what we're asked to do, is to make it relevant. Does that help?
Yeah.
All right, last one, 113, we're about to wrap up. Anybody online on Zoom?